sort of start flying up.
So I thought what I'll do is I've pre-recorded sort of like an intro and everything that I'll just sort of pop around you. So I thought what might be good to start off with is just like a little introduction about who I'm sitting with. So if you want to sort of, tell me who you are and what you do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shall we start?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go. Yeah.
Well, I'm Phyllis Butow. I'm the chair of the Sydney Catalyst Governing Council. But in other parts of my life, I'm a professor at the School of Psychology at the University of Sydney and an NHMRC fellow. So I work primarily in psycho-oncology. So I look at psychological issues in cancer, around supporting patients to cope with mental health issues as they move through their cancer experience, as well as looking at decision-making and communication between doctors and patients and family members and all of the complexities that go along with that. So I have an active research program in that area.
Fantastic.
So my name is Phillip Hogg. I'm a biochemist and a full-time researcher. I'm Deputy Director of Sydney Catalyst and also Chair of the Scientific Advisory Committee. My research is about how proteins work. Particularly, my team discovered this chemical modification of proteins, and we're trying to understand how that controls protein function in cancer. So very much working in the T1 space, trying to understand this biology at a fundamental level and use that information to develop new therapies and diagnostics for cancer.
Great. So I thought today would be a good opportunity to have a chat about translational research and what that actually means. There's a lot of cancer centres out there that operate under different models, and we use the translational scheme. So I thought we could start by having a discussion about the nuts and bolts of translational research. What does it mean? Maybe some examples of the different projects that operate in each of the different pipelines. So we might start with you, Phil, because you're T1.
Yep. So the T1 side of the pipeline, this is the discovery research. This is where we learn things about cancer, how it starts, how it develops. And with that information, trying to do, this will give us ideas about how we might be able to tackle the disease, whether it be prevention, whether it be diagnosis, or whether it be treatment. So it's the discovery end of the scheme. And discovery research is something that it's very hard to stage manage. So it's it works best when you get smart, committed, talented people together and just let them try to understand the biology they're investigating. And with that information, you learn things. You say, well, okay, we've learned that this happens then, and as a result of that information, we can say, well, if we target this particular aspect of how this, say, protein works, if you like, this may be a good way of treating cancer. And so at the T1 space, you go from the basic discovery, you with that information, you might be able to devise, a small molecule or a biological compound that will inhibit this process. And then you go about trying to test whether it works in cultured cells, cultured tumour cells, and then say possibly in animal models of cancer. And if it passes those tests, then you look to see whether you can turn this, if it's a therapy, into a drug. And it's a really quite a structured pipeline of work that you need to sort of proceed through before you can get to the point of testing it in human patients. And at that point, that's when it goes from T1 to T2 research. And the T2 is very much clinical testing of the discoveries that you've made in your T1 research.
So I think translational research really goes across the whole spectrum. We've already heard about T1 and moving into T2. And it really is a matter of thinking about right from the beginning how what you're doing might end up improving patient outcomes, whether that is through a drug that you've developed as a result of doing basic scientific research, or whether it is health services or psychological intervention that might help patients to cope with the disease. So you can do T1 research on a psychological intervention when you're doing the basic research that's going to build your understanding of the prevalence of psychological distress, for example, and mechanisms that might be increasing people's distress, all the way through to T3 research, which is really about how to get evidence, once you've got it, of efficacy into routine patient care. So I think sometimes people think that laboratory-based research is T1 and health services and psychosocial research is T3, but that's not really true. It's really around the stage of research that you're at, whether you're at the beginnings of learning about an issue or whether you are at the point of having great quality evidence because you've done the T2 clinical trials and now you want to get it into routine clinical practice, which is T3. So we've done work in my space from T1 all the way through to T3, and an example of T3 research, which is probably the one that we're least familiar with, is research I'm doing at the moment where we have proven that we've got interventions that can reduce anxiety and depression in cancer patients, and now we're trying to understand what interventions and what implementation strategies we need to help health services take up these interventions and deliver them on a routine basis. So, it really spans across.
I think you made an interesting point there, Phyllis, talking about T1 research in the area of sort of anxiety and depression, which people, I know a lot of people are working on sort of understanding the brain and how the brain functions in anxiety and depression. I think that's a really interesting point that you can sort of bring in other research areas that may not be specific to cancer but are specific to how we understand anxiety and depression and for example the brain more generally. I think that was a really interesting point. So at Sydney Catalyst we have T1, T2 working group and a T2, T3 working group. And something that really interests me is, I guess, that overlap between, is there a difference between the T2 research that happens in the T1, T2 space and the research that happens in the T2, T3 space, or is that sort of where the two or the three groups are connected? Can you sort of explain?
Look, Phyllis is a bit of a unique example, not unique, but you do the research right across to T1 to T3. People like me, we rarely get to T2. So at the fundamental research level, look, we obviously on the lookout for things that we think may have some practical value in the basic research we do, and we're absolutely delighted if we can take something we've discovered in the lab to testing in patients. But the reality is it's actually very rare, very rare for a T1 researcher to actually make it to the T2. But when it gets to the T2, I've been my training and experiences in T1 research, but when it gets to T2, I'm not in charge of that anymore. We need people who are expertise in the, real experts in the area to know how to trial a drug, what's the best indication for this drug, how best to administer it, what's the best combination for the drug, what's the best patient group, how to select that patient group, all of these decisions at the T2 level, there's and we Sydney Catalyst have a number of experts in that area. And when it gets to the T3, I'm even less qualified to sort of comment on in that space. So it's a bit different. The nature, I suppose, of what I do is that we really what we're supposed to be good at is that what we focus on is the T1, because that's what we're trained to do and that's what we're probably best at. And if we can get to T2, fantastic. But there is a point there where we have to hand it over to the experts.
And I mean, fundamentally, T2 is around doing clinical trials of efficacy, and it's the same whether it's T1, T2 or T2, T3, except that we might be extracting different information potentially, or interested in different information that's coming out of that clinical trial. So from a T1, T2 perspective, you're really interested in efficacy. Does this work, and with whom? In the T2, T3 space, we might also be looking at what modifies the effect. What are the issues that stop this being effective? Is there a context which is more appropriate for it to be used than elsewhere that might influence how we then go on to try and implement it in routine care? So the design of the research is the same, but we might be extracting different information.
Yeah, it's a whole spectrum, to sort of actually ultimately end up in improving patient care, improving the lives of cancer patients. It's a whole spectrum of research, and it all needs to work, and work well.
And the whole goal of Sydney Catalyst is to get people like Phil, who is a T1 person, to talk to people who are in the T2 and T3 space, so that we can extract all that information all along the way, so that by the time you get to T3, you know what you have to do to get it into clinical practice.
And so that's right, that's absolutely right. So we've got to T2 and some of the stuff that we've done. And, in our experience within T2 and speaking to the clinicians, that's informed the further T1 research that we need to do. So we've got that experience, what we've learned in the clinical trial. And the clinicians and people like Phyllis have told us that, okay, this is what we need. So then we go back to the lab and try to design a molecule that's better, or looking for better combinations, more effective combinations that, that will fit a patient group, for example. And so, we need to be... So, the different aspects, whether it's T1, T2, they all inform each other. And that's when it works well, when they do, they do inform each other in terms of future directions and where you're going.
So just following on that point, do you think that we should have a third group, which is T3, T1, to close, I guess, the loop of translational research? Because, as we've said, translational research is not linear. It's a cycle. So do you think there's space for...
Well, I think that T1 is influenced by, ongoingly, by where the gaps are in routine clinical practice. So it's when you go to a clinician who says, I've got this patient, I have no idea what to do with them because we don't have an evidence base for anything, that you might then think about going back to T1 and trying to find something to fill that gap. So in that sense, there is a constant need for... both parties to be talking to each other, and that's where that influence comes in. I don't know whether you need another group. We do try and get the T1, T2 group to talk to the T2, T3 group, so you don't want to keep that completely separately. But there are things that just have to be done in the T1, space that really require that sort of skill, which is a bit different to the... So I think there's... an advantage in
so
not
it's kind of already happening.
It is already happening. It is already happening. We do get together as T1, T2 or T2, T3 researchers, but in each of those communities there are clinicians and people with experience across the spectrum. So although we might focus on one particular area, there is experience around the table. So we get that feedback and that information.
Good. I think that's pretty much all of my questions. I'm kind of interested in, maybe for some of our new members or people who are thinking of joining Sydney Catalyst, maybe sort of your top five tips about how you sort of choose where you sit in the translational pipeline, sort of what sort of things should you be, looking for, or, do you have any advice on...
Okay, so you're talking probably a bit more career advice. If you see yourself as a career as a cancer researcher, whether it be the T1, T2, T3 space, how do you succeed in that space? Is that the sort of question you're asking?
No, I'm sort of, for people who aren't sure where they sit, are there do you have any advice on how you might identify yourself as a T1 researcher or T1, T2, or what's the best approach to?
I think in most cases it'll be pretty obvious where you sit. If you're in wet lab laboratory-based research, you're T1, and you may sort of venture into T2. And so, that's most people will, if you're involved in fundamental research, it will be T1, possibly T2. So I don't think it'll be difficult for people to identify where they sit in that spectrum.
It's probably harder for the T2, T3, because, again, people get confused about that. So if you're doing if you're developing new interventions and you are testing them in clinical trials, then you're doing T2 space. If you're up to the point where you're trying to look at effectiveness in routine practice and you're trying to change health services, which is, more health services research, then you're more in the T3 space. Most people are T2. There's still not many people who are working in the T3 space, and funding for T3 research is also poorer than in T2, which drives people back to T2.
Yeah.
We need more expertise, we need more research in T3 because there are so many interventions, drugs, other ways of improving patient outcomes that have been proven and are sitting on the shelf and not being used. So, the health services end of the spectrum needs building up.
Yeah, it's interesting. Right now, just in terms of how things are travelling, probably where the best source of funding is in the T2 space. The T1 traditionally has been, in this country, has been sort of well funded, but it's shifting more to sort of the T2 space. There's a lot of opportunities in the T2 space for funding now. As Phyllis said, T3 is suffering as well. So we have this bit of a hump in terms of where the opportunities are. But look, I wouldn't get hung up on whether you're a T1,
That's
T2,
right.
T3. Look, what you do is, if the key to success in this business, a lot of it's about finding a niche. Choosing a problem, a big question that is clearly important and relevant and significant, and coming up with novel and innovative ways of trying to answer that question that you've asked. And so that's the key. So if find something that you love and you're very good at, and try to be the best in the world at it.
I'd reinforce that. And you need to be an excellent and rigorous researcher wherever you sit, and you need to enjoy it, and you need to like the people that you're working with.
Yeah.
And that will give you a satisfying and successful career more than really trying to angle yourself anywhere.
Yes, absolutely.
I would say I think that there are opportunities in T3, and that there are moves within government and other organisations to try and offer more opportunities to T3 research. So I think there's some opportunities there, but you have to things that you love and work hard at them.
Yeah, don't chase trends and fads. Don't feel like you need to be working in this space because this is where the opportunities are. Look, we all have strengths and weaknesses. I think I'd be a terrible T3 researcher, but what I think I'm best at is the T1 stuff. So and you know that, so just be confident. You know what you're good at and where what you're passionate about, and stay with it. If you're very good at it, you will get support and you will build a good career. Don't and it is important to focus in this business too. It's part of finding a niche. You find a niche and you really focus on that big question, and it may be one big question for your entire career. That's fine. So that focus, that constantly questioning what you're doing and why you're doing it and how you're doing it, making sure you're staying current, state of the art in terms of how you're answering that question. But it's that focus, finding that niche, and if you can do that, you'll have a very rewarding career.
I agree. I do think that the translational focus can be helpful to people to keep in mind, and sometimes they don't. And that communication with clinicians down the track, and the flow of I need something to help this patient, going back to the the lab and being tested in the middle, and the flow of communication around that. Yes, you've proven this, but I've still got this gap. Generates research ideas and opportunities for significant research that's going to make a difference.
Yeah.
And research funders are interested in significance. So that focus on translation and the communication around the stream, I think, is very helpful to new researchers.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, absolutely. So that's a big part of trying to identify the question, finding a niche, finding that big question you're going to focus on. And it's and having, a broad understanding of the, of the field in which you work is very important. It's critical to do that, and this is where, understanding at a really big picture level, what really do we need to, to do? What are the big questions? Where's the big unmet needs? Because, once you focus on an area or, decide on that question, it's it could be 10, 15, 20-year commitment. So you've got to try to get that big question right.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think, was it Francis Crick said, if you ask big questions, you'll get big answers. And so that's absolutely true. Try to, find that big question and answer it in ways that, that really will set you apart.
Yeah. Well, I'm disappointed that we're out of time because this is a really interesting discussion, and I think it's something we can, probably build on at a later date. But yeah, that was really great.
Good.
Is there anything else you want to add?
That was Phyllis.
I love that.